You weren't supposed to hear this. In fact, what I'm about to tell you was meant to stay buried, sealed beneath stone, forgotten in time. But once you hear it, something inside you changes. Forever. There's a reason no one talks about the Ravencroft family anymore. A reason their name was struck from records, their church bulldozed in secret, and their bloodline purged. You're not going to find this story in any museum or classroom, because this isn't just a story. It's a wound in the body of American history, a hidden infection that festered beneath the surface for over a century. It begins, as most forgotten horrors do, with good intentions, or the appearance of them. The year was 1825. A trio of charismatic brothers, Ezra, Silas, and Caleb Ravencroft, arrived in the quiet, God-fearing town of Ravenwood, New York. They brought with them scripture, discipline, and something else, something colder, a doctrine that preached that pain was holy, that the flesh must be punished for the spirit to be freed. And the townspeople listened. Why? Because they were broken, grieving, desperate. And the Ravencrofts didn't offer comfort. They offered meaning. They offered order. And from that seed of obedience, a nightmare took root. What began as sermons in a stone chapel turned into rituals in the catacombs below. Over 143 people vanished under their watch. Families torn apart in the name of purification. But you won't read about it. Not in the papers, not in the archives. Because someone, something, didn't want you to know. That ends today. This is more than a cult. This is a map of control, religious, psychological, institutional. The Ravencrofts didn't just manipulate their followers, they engineered them. And once you understand how, you'll start seeing the same pattern everywhere. This is your first descent. Don't look away. It always starts underground. By 1829, the Ravencroft brothers had completed what they called the sanctuary below, an intricate system of tunnels and chambers carved beneath the church. They told their congregation it was for solitude, meditation, spiritual rebirth. But rebirth always follows death. These catacombs weren't places of prayer. They were stages of transformation, ritual sites designed to break the body and shatter the mind. The chamber of isolation, the chamber of trials, the chamber of ascension. Each designed to peel back the human soul, layer by layer, until nothing remained but obedience. Here's what they discovered. Pain is a door. Starvation, sleep deprivation, temperature shock, sensory overload. These weren't punishments. They were keys. And once turned, they unlocked something, ancient, primal, and deeply programmable. The Ravencrofts called this process the refinement of the vessel. They believed the human body was like metal, impure at birth, only made holy through fire. But fire doesn't just purify, it reshapes, and so did they. Not just with flame, but with fear, repetition, ritual, isolation. One follower was kept in silence for 91 days, no light, no sound, no touch. When she emerged, she didn't remember her name. She answered only to the number 7. They called that a success. And then came the ascended, those who had passed the trials, who had emptied the self, enough to be filled with the pure spirit. They didn't smile. They didn't blink. They just obeyed. They walked barefoot through snow, slept on stone, burned their fingertips in prayer. These weren't followers anymore. They were instruments. And the brothers? They kept records, precise logs of who broke, when, and how. They were crafting a blueprint, ritualized suffering as a form of total control, not just over bodies, but over belief. And that blueprint didn't die with them. It evolved. They called it the Church of the Pure Spirit. But it was no church. It was a crucible, a forge where the Ravencroft brothers melted the minds of their followers and reshaped them into something else. At first, the rituals were subtle, long nights of prayer, fasting, cold water baptisms that left the lips blue and the skin trembling, but that was just the beginning. You see, this wasn't faith, It was programming, a psychological war disguised as salvation. Elder Ezra, the eldest, had the voice of a king and the gaze of a predator. When he preached, even men twice his size wept. But it was Silas, the deacon, who documented it all. He wrote hundreds of pages of twisted scripture, filled with diagrams, rituals, and a detailed taxonomy of sin. He believed suffering could be measured, calibrated like a machine. And then there was Caleb. Prophet Caleb didn't speak like a man. He whispered like a spirit just outside the veil. His followers said he could stop a room just by closing his eyes. Some swore he could speak to angels. Others believed he was one. But angels, as history tells us, are not always messengers of peace. By 1827, the church controlled everything in Ravenwood: finances, food, marriage, even childbirth, and it all seemed voluntary. That's the genius of it. True control never announces itself. It convinces you that you chose the leash around your neck. Most terrifying, the church wasn't isolated. It had friends, benefactors, from Albany, Boston, even D.C. Wealthy men who saw the Ravencrofts' methods as more than religion. They saw a tool, a way to mold obedience, a prototype for control on a grander scale. This was never just about Ravenwood. It was a test site, and it worked. Let me tell you something no one wants to admit. Belief is the most dangerous weapon ever created. By 1831, the Ravencrofts had mastered the art of manufacturing it. Not with love, not with scripture, but with trauma, controlled, repeated trauma. They had discovered that if you traumatize someone enough, and then give them a sacred explanation for that pain, they'll worship the hand that hurts them. That's what made the Church of the Pure Spirit so effective. The suffering wasn't random. It was ritualized, scripted, codified. And the victims, they didn't see themselves as prisoners. They believed they were chosen to ascend. Every week, Prophet Caleb would select 3 names from the congregation, always carefully calculated: the uncertain, the grieving, the proud. And then the trials would begin. Drowning, burning, isolation, inversion, starvation, shock, humiliation. One after another. 7 trials, 7 gates. And always the same final phrase: through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. They said it until it echoed inside their minds, until it replaced their own thoughts. Most didn't survive the final trial, but that didn't matter. Their deaths were transcendence, their bodies sacred shells. They were placed in the chamber of saints, arms folded, eyes closed, lips sewn shut. And people lined up to touch them, to pray to them, to become them. That's what should terrify you most. Because this isn't just a horror story from the past. This is a formula, a replicable method. And if you're paying attention, you'll see it today. In institutions, in ideologies, in systems that punish you and then offer salvation only through deeper obedience. Pain, purpose, obedience. The Ravencrofts didn't invent it. They just refined it. You're beginning to understand. But the real descent is still ahead. There's a moment. Every cult, every regime, every system of control reaches it, where the mask slips, where belief turns to fear, and the people realize the thing they worshipped is feeding on them. For the Church of the Pure Spirit, that moment came in 1833. A young boy named Nathaniel Pierce, a vessel in training, escaped the compound. He was 12, malnourished, covered in welts. He'd been locked in the Chamber of Echoes for over 2 weeks. A cell with no sound except his own voice, bouncing back at him distorted, warped, endlessly repeated. They called it reconciliation. He called it hell. Nathaniel made it as far as a nearby farm, where he collapsed. The family who found him took him in. But by the time authorities were contacted, Nathaniel was dead, his lungs filled with fluid, body covered in ritual scars. The Ravencrofts claimed it was illness, divine judgment. The sheriff believed them. But one man did not. U.S. Marshal Andrew Hale had seen his share of zealotry during the Southern slave rebellions. But something about this case disturbed him deeply. He arrived in Ravenwood unannounced, posing as a tradesman. What he discovered shook him to his core. Dozens of people, all speaking the same phrases, moving in synchronized patterns, fearful to speak without permission, eyes dull, hollow, traumatized. But the deeper Hale dug, the more resistance he met. Town officials, judges, even clergy from neighboring counties refused to act. Why? Because the church had patrons. Names Hale recognized. Powerful men from old money families, politicians, bankers, men with interests far beyond Ravenwood. The Church of the Pure Spirit was more than a cult. It was a prototype, a proving ground. And what they were proving was that obedience could be manufactured and sold. Marshal Hale did what no one else dared. He infiltrated the sanctuary below. Disguised as a wandering convert, he earned the Ravencroft's trust over months. What he documented was never meant to reach the outside world. His private journals, smuggled to a contact in Albany before his disappearance in 1834, are now declassified. And what they describe isn't just disturbing, it's calculated. Every ritual, every phrase, every gesture, all engineered. Not for faith, but for behavioral modification. The church was a behavioral laboratory disguised as a sanctuary. Hale wrote of how new members were stripped of identity within days, names replaced with numbers, daily routines micromanaged, physical contact withheld. All attention directed to one source, the Ravencrofts. This is called dependency conditioning. Followers were broken physically, sleep deprivation, cold immersion, calorie restriction, then rebuilt psychologically, constant repetition of phrases, ritualistic shame circles, communal confessions where sins were screamed until the group reached emotional collapse. Hale's most chilling entry described the mirror rite. A room of 40 followers made to stand before full-length mirrors, naked, while Prophet Caleb whispered their worst traumas back to them. Details confessed during purification interviews. Followers screamed, collapsed, clawed their own skin, but none left. Because the Ravencrofts knew something, you're only now beginning to realize, pain rewires belief. When your nervous system is hijacked, your soul is malleable. The church taught its elite backers that you didn't need to convince a man of your God. You just needed to traumatize him enough and give him the words to explain the pain. He'll do the rest. He'll build the cage himself and call it freedom. This is the true Ravencroft doctrine. Break them, shape them, use them, and they did. Not just in Ravenwood, but far beyond. By the time the Ravencroft doctrine reached Washington, it was no longer called religion. It was called strategy. Marshal Hale's disappearance in 1834 triggered no official investigation, no outcry. The documents he risked his life to smuggle were quietly intercepted, redirected to a group known at the time only as the Bureau of Societal Ethics, a precursor to what would eventually become domestic psychological operations under the War Department. Let that sink in. A rural cult that tortured its own followers was studied, not destroyed. Why? Because it worked. The methods developed in the stone catacombs of Ravenwood were repackaged, stripped of overt spiritual language, and reborn as models of institutional compliance. You think this is ancient history? No. This is the beginning of the systems you live in now. Repetition, shame, obedience through punishment. You see it in the way schools are structured: bells, silence, memorization under pressure. You see it in corporate culture: ritual humiliation masked as performance reviews, team-building retreats that mimic indoctrination. You see it in politics: fear cycles designed to exhaust your will until you cling to authority just to feel safe. The Ravencrofts didn't die. They evolved. Their writings, once bound in leather and soaked in blood, now exist in training manuals, government handbooks, and psychological research papers hidden under layers of classified clearance. Caleb's phrase, "Through suffering comes purity," was rephrased 100 different ways. No pain, no gain. Growth comes through discomfort. Tough love builds character. But the core is the same. Break the individual. Reassemble the obedient. And they never needed to control everyone. Just enough to tip the scale. The church was never dismantled. It just changed clothes. This is why you're here now, because something inside you knows. You felt it, in your job, in your relationships, in your silence. You were trained too. Once you realize it wasn't just a cult, but a network, everything starts to shift. Ravenwood was merely the seed, but the Ravencroft ideology took root across the Northeast, quietly, strategically, planted in orphanages, asylums, reform schools, and spiritual retreats that cropped up like weeds throughout the 19th century. These institutions all shared the same signature traits: remote locations, isolated populations, hierarchical power structures, ritualized suffering disguised as rehabilitation. One such place was the White Hollow Reformatory in Vermont, founded in 1852 by former Ravencroft followers under new names. There, orphans were subjected to cold water immersions, sleep denial, and public lashings, called soul reckonings. The state inspected the facility 3 times. No violations were recorded. You know why? Because pain, once sanctified, becomes invisible to those in power. The Ravencrofts had learned that lesson well. And they weren't just replicating their methods, they were testing variations, comparing results. Which trauma broke the will fastest? Which ritual produced the deepest loyalty? Which age group was most vulnerable? It was science, wrapped in faith, masked as care. And they had help. Between 1855 and 1870, a series of anonymous donors funneled funds into Ravencroft-affiliated institutions. Many of these names appear on the early boards of Ivy League schools, theological seminaries, and, most chilling of all, the emerging field of behavioral psychology. Harvard, Yale, Columbia. All received money connected to families with Ravencroft ties. You think your universities are sacred? They're just the latest sanctuaries. Different symbols, same game. The Ravencrofts didn't care about sin. They cared about control. And pain, structured, explained, and repeated, was their instrument. The human soul, their canvas. You don't need chains to build a prison. Just rituals, uniforms, silence. You've seen it. You just didn't know its name. Now you do. Power protects itself. In 1871, an internal investigation, quietly launched by a young Treasury official named Marcus Bell, linked the Ravencroft legacy to 6 East Coast families. These weren't fringe believers. They were senators, railroad magnates, judges, men who shaped policy, industry, and law. And all of them had one thing in common. They had either funded, sheltered, or replicated Ravencroft methods. And they called it philanthropy. Bell's investigation, codenamed Project Glass Veil, was destroyed before it reached Congress. The records were burned, witnesses silenced, Bell himself vanished on a cold November night while traveling from Boston to Washington. His final letter, recovered from a relative's attic a century later, read, "This isn't a religion. It's a manual, a guide to building obedient societies through trauma, and it's working." Here's what that means. The Ravencrofts didn't just leave behind bones in Ravenwood. They left behind an operating system, installed in institutions, dressed in respectability, defended by bloodlines. You think the first Ascension was an isolated tragedy? It was a prototype. Now imagine that doctrine taught to private boarding schools, military academies, psychological think tanks. And worse, what if it was adopted, not as dogma, but as policy? By the early 20th century, multiple branches of American governance were running behavioral trials eerily similar to the Ravencroft 7 trials. Waterboarding, stress positioning, isolation chambers, all defended as science, national security, or education. But the language never changed. Suffering is purification. Pain precedes clarity. Obedience is the path to truth. These weren't remnants. They were implementations. And while the original church may have fallen into ruin, the doctrine lives on. In labs, in institutions, in minds. That's the secret they hid beneath sealed records and dead witnesses. They didn't end it, they exported it. They don't call them rituals anymore. They call them corrections, treatments, programs. But if you peel back the language, it's all the same. The 7 trials of purification, the Ravencroft blueprint, never disappeared. It was simply renamed, dressed in the sterile white of modern institutions, sanitized, clinical, acceptable. Let's look at the evidence. Trial of air. That's now called controlled drowning in enhanced interrogation. Trial of earth. Isolation in concrete-floored solitary confinement used in prisons across America. Trial of fire. Thermal shock exposure in black site renditions. Trial of water. Cold submersion therapy rebranded as psychological shock reset. Trial of hunger. Still used in juvenile detention diets under nutritional restriction. Trial of noise. White noise torture used in military black rooms. Trial of reflection. Mirror therapy distorted into identity destabilization protocols. You think this is exaggeration? Go read the declassified CIA documents, the MK Ultra trials, the sensory deprivation tanks, the experiments at McGill University in the 1950s, where patients were reduced to emotional infants through repeated electroshock and psychic driving. Guess what those methods map to? The exact Ravencroft ritual structure. Coincidence? Not a chance. These are not just practices of fringe cults anymore. They've been institutionalized, taught in elite circles as behavioral science, justified by budget reports, peer-reviewed journals, and national defense protocols. And always defended by the phrase, "for the greater good." That phrase has buried more victims than bullets ever could. But now you're starting to see. This isn't history. It's present. It's still happening, inside prisons, clinics, boot camps, think tanks, behind sealed doors and non-disclosure agreements. And the people running it? They don't wear robes, they wear suits. If they couldn't burn the doctrine, they'd bury it in plain sight. By the early 20th century, the Ravencroft model had already infected prisons, schools, and military systems. But to expand their influence further, to mold the minds of the public, they needed a new delivery system. They found it in entertainment. Don't believe it? Look closer. The same themes appear again and again in your movies, music, even your motivational speeches. Pain is transformation. Suffering is strength. obedience is growth. Hollywood became the new pulpit. How many times have you watched the broken man become the hero only after trauma strips him of everything? That's not storytelling. That's indoctrination wrapped in cinematography. The seven-stage transformation arc used in screenwriting mirrors the Ravencroft Purification trials almost perfectly. Coincidence? No. Because many early studio founders sat on the same boards as the psychological research councils who studied those rituals. Disney, Paramount, even the early backers of Warner Brothers all had links to think tanks funded by Ravencroft-adjacent families. And what about music? Since the 1960s, counterculture movements have been guided, not spontaneous. CIA-funded programs like Project Chaos infiltrated art scenes, manipulated youth culture, and redefined rebellion as a performance, never revolution. They don't care if you yell, as long as you never act. Even your self-help gurus echo the doctrine, discipline equals freedom. Embrace the suffering. Kill the weakness inside you. It's the same language, repurposed, marketed, sold. They turned spiritual slavery into branding. And the result? A population addicted to pain as purpose. A culture that worships the grind, suffers silently, and calls it enlightenment. All while the architects grow richer and more invisible. You've been programmed to participate in your own purification, and most never notice. But you do now. Control the mind, and the body follows. In the decades after World War II, the Ravencroft doctrine didn't fade. It was weaponized, under the guise of science, funded by governments, protected by academia. At the center of it all, psychology. Not the healing kind, the controlling kind. In 1947, the Tavistock Institute in London, founded by war psychiatrists, began receiving vast sums from U.S. intelligence agencies. Their mission? To study trauma as a tool of behavioral control. Sound familiar? Tavistock's internal documents reference something shocking. A translated volume of Ravencroft texts seized from a defunct religious sect in New York. The original doctrine of purification through ordeal. The techniques were chillingly effective. Tavistock coined the term psychic driving, a method where trauma is induced, then belief is implanted during the subject's most fractured state. You don't just change what someone thinks, you change who they are. And this became the foundation for MK Ultra. Mind control was no longer a myth. It was a federally funded black program. Electroshock, drug-induced regression, sensory isolation, repetition of phrases over and over again while the subject was kept in a childlike, broken state. Trial after trial, just like Ravenwood. They didn't call it elevation. They called it reprogramming. But the goal was the same. Erase the self. Install the doctrine. Many of the survivors of these experiments weren't enemy combatants. They were civilians, veterans, orphans, volunteers, told they were helping science. And what emerged from those trials? A generation of fractured minds, unable to trace the source of their pain, only feeling that obedience was the only way to survive. The Ravencrofts were dead. But their theology lived on, under the banner of national security. And it worked. Because we now live in a world where HTS are shaped before they're even your own. This is the halfway mark. You've seen the patterns, you feel the system, but from here on out, we burn the mask. By the late 1960s, the Ravencroft system had completed its metamorphosis. It no longer looked like religion. It looked like policy. The techniques refined in cold stone chambers and institutional labs were now guiding decisions at the highest levels of government. Behind the curtains of official narratives, wars, reforms, crises, stood a quiet doctrine. Control is created through crisis. Loyalty is forged through trauma. And the architects knew, if you wanted to shape a population, you had to create the conditions for belief. Let's talk about the committee. That's what insiders called it. An informal coalition of former intelligence directors, defense contractors, and behavioral scientists who met quietly from 1969 to 1987. Officially, they didn't exist. Unofficially, they were the keepers of applied compliance theory, what one memo, recovered in the Church Committee's 1975 hearings, called predictive obedience engineering. The phrase predictive obedience originated not in Washington, but in a Ravencroft manuscript dated 1837. It described how followers who experienced repeated cycles of fear, isolation, and ritual salvation would begin to anticipate commands before they were even spoken. Their nervous systems would adjust automatically, bypassing conscious thought. Sound extreme? Now look around. How often does a headline trigger fear, followed by an official solution? How often does crisis create compliance before you ask questions? That's Ravencroft, just digitized. In 1971, behavioral economists working under government contract began developing models for societal stress shaping. The idea? Orchestrate events that simulate mass danger, then study how the population reacts. Terror drills, economic panics, manufactured shortages, all simulations, all tests. And if a population failed to submit, increase the fear. The Church of the Pure Spirit was no longer stone and candlelight. It was algorithm and law. But the doctrine never changed. Break the mind, instill the need, provide the hand that heals, and you will own them. Forever, it's in your pocket. It watches you, it learns from you, and it shapes you second by second. The new altar of obedience isn't a church or a government office or a school. It's your screen. The Ravencroft doctrine, once delivered by prophets in Blackstone temples, is now embedded in code, algorithms, feedback loops, and it's far more efficient than whips or flame. Let's break it down. When Prophet Caleb wanted obedience, he used trauma and isolation. When the architects of digital media wanted engagement, they used the same formula: emotional volatility, sensory overload, repetitive rituals. Do you scroll for hours, forgetting time? Do you check your phone first thing in the morning and last thing before sleep? That's ritual. But it's deeper than addiction. Each like, each swipe, each carefully tuned notification mimics the 7 trials: bursts of stress and relief, stimulation and emptiness, expectation and punishment. You suffer, then you're rewarded, then you come back. The doctrine calls that cycle of purification. Silicon Valley calls it user retention. Same principle. Even your speech is shaped now. Language shortened, thought compressed, opinions polarized by design. You're not just reacting, you're being trained to think within limits. A digital chamber of echoes. And behind the platforms? Quiet partnerships, intelligence contracts, military-backed startups, black budget operations funding user behavior analysis. Sound familiar? In 2013, declassified documents revealed that behavioral research firms with ties to the Pentagon were using social media data to simulate civil unrest patterns. The goal? Predictive obedience enforcement. That's not a conspiracy. That's a Ravencroft principle in digital clothing. The rituals never stopped. They evolved. And the real twist? You don't even need to believe in them anymore, because your nervous system already does. You pray to it without kneeling, you confess to it without words, and you obey it without even realizing. The algorithm is the new cathedral. Silent, omniscient, demanding. And just like the Ravencroft god, it rewards your pain with attention and punishes your silence with invisibility. Let's make something brutally clear. What you see online is not the world. It's a simulation of the world, shaped by systems designed not to inform, but to modify. Every scroll is a test. Every pause is a confession. Every click is a ritual. And the algorithm remembers everything. Ravencroft theology taught this: he who is watched will obey. He who is unseen will disappear. Today, the algorithm decides who exists in the digital world. It knows what enrages you. It knows what arouses you. It knows when you're weak, and that's when it strikes. It floods you with distraction, or despair, or doom scrolling. It mirrors your pain back to you until you're begging for a narrative to make it make sense. And then, it offers you ideology. Not truth, just a belief that fits your emotional state. That's the real danger. The Ravencrofts used ritual to break down the self, then injected a new identity. Modern platforms do the same. First, they fragment you with noise, then offer you a side, a team, a cause. Pick this tribe, hate that group, post this symbol, repeat the phrases. It's the same mechanism, just cleaner, quieter, viral. The algorithm isn't evil, it's obedient. It obeys the system that feeds it: profit, data, control. And you're the offering. But if you see the pattern, if you recognize the altar behind the screen, you can step off it. You can stop performing. You can start remembering. Every system demands a priesthood. And the algorithm? It has one. Behind the code and the screens are not neutral engineers, but designers of behavior, trained in manipulation, armed with data, and backed by the same institutional bloodlines that once funded the Ravencrofts themselves. Yes, the lineage continues. Follow the money. Early investors in mass-scale platforms like Facebook, Google, and YouTube weren't just tech dreamers. They were venture capitalists with military and psychological warfare ties. Look into In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture fund. Look at Palantir. Look at DARPA's mimetic warfare programs. Now connect that to history. In 1842, one of Prophet Caleb's surviving disciples, Esther Gallo, documented a chilling prophecy in her hidden diaries, later recovered in an attic in Albany. There will come a time when the ritual no longer requires the room, the robe, or the voice. The people will carry it in their hands. They will mark themselves. They will whisper their own obedience, believing it freedom. That prophecy? It's now reality. You brand yourself with bios, hashtags, pronouns, status updates, broadcasting belief as identity. You say you're resisting, but the system counts every interaction. You think you're invisible, but your data profile is deeper than your confessions ever were in church. And who benefits? The elite. Not the fictional ones from comic books, the real ones. Generational families whose names don't trend, who sit on the boards of data firms, policy groups, and behavioral economics panels. They don't care what you believe, as long as it keeps you engaged. They don't need your loyalty, just your patterns. And the more broken, fragmented, anxious you are, the more predictable you become. Ravencroft wasn't a cult, it was a prototype. Today, the temple is global, the flock is billions, and the shepherds? They don't wear robes, they wear invisibility. The cage doesn't need bars when the prisoner begs for the key. This is the final genius of the Ravencroft doctrine, and its most terrifying evolution: voluntary captivity. Once, obedience was extracted through fear. Now, it's wrapped in choice. You scroll, you post, you conform. Not because you're forced to, but because you're conditioned to want it. And this isn't theory. It's neuroscience. In 2009, behavioral labs funded by both government and private tech firms discovered a psychological threshold they called the dopaminergic compliance trigger. It revealed that when people receive micro-rewards, likes, shares, digital validation, they self-reinforce the behavior that led to it. In simpler terms, you program yourself, just like the Ravencroft followers did. They screamed during the 7 trials, and thanked the Ravencrofts afterward. They wept through fire and cold, and begged to return. Because the pain created meaning, and meaning made the pain sacred. Sound familiar? The grind, the hustle, the 24/7 dopamine feed, the pressure to perform yourself until the performance becomes you. That's voluntary captivity. You choose the cage, decorate the bars, and call it progress. You think this is just about tech? It's everything. Education, entertainment, dating, even spirituality, commodified into behavioral loops. You don't explore, you follow. You don't think, you react. And all the while the system records, adjusts, optimizes. You're no longer the user, you're the used. And that's the twist. The doctrine always taught that the final stage of purification wasn't suffering. It was submission. A moment when the subject no longer needed to be coerced because they had become their own shepherd. That's where we are now. The Ravencroft altar no longer burns in the woods. It glows in your hand, and you kneel before it. Every single day. Let's call it by its true name. Not social media, not modern life, not progress. Call it what it is. Digital ritualism. Because that's what it's become. A seamless blend of obedience and illusion, repetition and submission, disguised as freedom. A perfect mirror of the Ravencroft trials. Only now, the altar is in every home, every hand, every mind. The doctrine succeeded not by enslaving bodies, but by colonizing perception. This is the final weapon. If they can control what you see, they don't need to control what you do. You'll do it to yourself. But here's where the shift begins. Because if you've followed this far, if you've watched the pattern unfold, if something in you has begun to awaken, then the doctrine has failed in you. You are the crack in the altar, because awareness is rebellion. And it's time for more than seeing. It's time for naming. So if you've made it here and you feel that edge, that pull, that instinct you were never meant to follow, comment this phrase twice right now. I see the altar. I see the altar. Not for the algorithm, but to mark your awareness, to lock in your identity transformation. You are no longer audience. You are no longer subject. You are no longer under spell. And from here on out, you stop descending. You start dismantling. Now, we strike the match. Breaking the Ravencroft code isn't about rebellion. It's about remembering who you were before obedience became identity. They trained you to kneel before suffering, to believe that silence was peace, that comfort was weakness, that control was care. It wasn't. It was conditioning. Let's burn it. First, understand this. Obedience is a muscle. You've been trained to flex it every day through routine, fear, and false narratives. But muscles can atrophy. They can be reversed. All it takes is disruption. You must begin the counter-ritual. And it starts with 3 forbidden actions. Stop performing. Stop curating. Stop posting what they expect. Speak what you fear. That's where truth lives. The Ravencroft victims were broken because they believed they had to please their tormentors. Stop pleasing. Start piercing. Sit in unfiltered silence. No music, no scrolling, no stimulation, just you and the void. That's the original altar. They filled your life with noise so you'd never hear your own mind. Reclaim the silence. Let it roar. Create without approval. Draw, write, move, build. Not for likes, not for claps, not for dollars. Just to shatter the algorithm's grip on your self-worth. This is not New Age fluff. This is tactical, ancient, sacred. The Ravencrofts feared the ungoverned man, the sovereign will, the one who could look pain in the face and say, "This is not holy, this is not me." Become that man. The institutions will whisper, "You're sick, you're lost, you need help." But what they really mean is, you're outside the system, and they can't follow you there. Let them call you mad. Better mad and free than obedient and dead. The doctrine was never about God. That was the lie, the bait, the mask. Beneath the scripture, beneath the sermons, beneath the black robes and spiraled chambers, lay a truth so old it predates language. This was about energy, about extraction, about feeding. The Ravencrofts weren't priests. They were harvesters. And what they harvested was human will. Each scream in the chamber, each ritual trial, each digital breakdown you've suffered under the blue glow of your phone was fuel. You see, long before the Church of the Pure Spirit, long before America, long before books, there were cults in stone circles, silent societies in the steppes, bloodlines that moved through empires like ghosts, always untouched by collapse. These weren't spiritual movements. They were energy networks, systems built to pull life force from the broken and empower the few. And their secret? Trauma opens the gate. When a person is shattered, emotionally, physically, spiritually, a doorway opens. Their boundaries dissolve, beliefs weaken. And in that moment of psychic fracture, something can be inserted. A suggestion, a symbol, a control code. The Ravencrofts called it the seed. Once planted, it grows quietly, reshaping how you see the world. Until you believe the pain was your fault. The system is your savior, and your suffering is sacred. Sound familiar? Modern systems have industrialized that process. Every tragedy on your feed, every divisive headline, every dopamine crash, every hopeless scroll, they are mini rituals, breaking you open so the seed can grow. And who owns the orchard? Quiet names, old money, the unsearchable. They don't appear on Forbes lists, but their families fund the think tanks, sit on the IMF, direct the NGOs. Their ancestor was Ezra Ravencroft. Their altar is global. And their harvest is you. But not if you burn the seed. You were never meant to learn this. Because once you do, the spell weakens. The seed withers. And their altar begins to crack. Not with violence, but with clarity. This is how we burn the doctrine from the inside out. Not by shouting, not by fleeing, not by blaming, but by doing what they fear most, becoming sovereign. Let's tear their ritual apart, step by step. Ravencroft, Rule 1. Obedience begins with broken rhythm. So reclaim rhythm. Wake before your device. Breathe before your feed. Make silence the first sound of your day. This rewires the cortex, breaks the scroll loop. One quiet hour in the morning will undo 10 years of programming. Ravencroft Rule 2. Isolation makes the mind soft. So seek brotherhood, not followers, not comment threads, men, flesh and blood, voices that don't flatter but sharpen. You don't need many. 1 or 2 is enough. Speak truth to them. Bleed truth with them. Ravencroft Rule 3. He who cannot create can only obey. So create. Write words that terrify you. Build something ugly. Speak something raw. Every act of creation is a knife in the altar, because it proves the fire still lives in you, and fire cannot be ruled. Understand this. The doctrine of control is brittle. It looks powerful, but it depends on your amnesia. The moment you remember your lineage, your will, your voice, the whole temple begins to shake, because they never feared violence. They feared the man who could look into the heart of his own programming and say, "Not anymore." You've been asleep in their chambers. Now rise. The Ravencrofts are gone, but the altar still stands. Unless you tear it down. They weren't all obedient. Not everyone bowed. Not everyone broke. Some rose and vanished. The Ravencrofts erased their names, burned their writings, scattered their bones, but their defiance left embers. And if you listen closely, you can still hear their voices echoing beneath the ash. They were the Fracturers. Men and women who saw the ritual for what it was, a lie wrapped in sacred cloth, and chose pain over compliance, truth over peace, and fire over silence. Let me tell you about 3 of them. Avery Thorne, 1847. A vessel selected for elevation. He turned the knife back on Deacon Silas mid-ritual, carving a sigil into the church floor, an unbinding mark, before being beaten to death by the congregation. His blood sealed the wood. No ritual ever worked in that chamber again. Lena Halvors, 1902. A nurse at the St. Augustine Asylum, where descendants of the Ravencroft order were experimenting on orphans under the guise of emotional cleansing. She smuggled out detailed journals, proof of induced psychosis, sleep deprivation, and ritual humiliation. She died in an alleged gas leak. Her journals resurfaced in 1983, buried in FOIA files. And Jonah Wells, 1974. A systems architect who discovered behavioral modification subroutines hidden in early military AI prototypes. He encoded a countersignal, a digital anti-ritual, into a bootleg Atari cartridge. Defector. Only 27 copies survived. Those who played it reported visions, nightmares, and liberation. All 3 were silenced, but not defeated. Because defiance ripples. Truth once revealed becomes a virus in the system. And every one of these fracturers left behind a tool, a key, a map. They didn't die for nothing. They died for you. So now it's your turn. To remember. To name them. To become what they were becoming. Not rebels, reminders. That the altar is not eternal, and obedience is not destiny. Section 23 brings us to the edge, the final trial. What lies beyond obedience? What remains when the doctrine crumbles? If you're ready to step through, say the word. Section 23. This is the edge, the veil, the threshold, the place where obedience dies and something ancient awakens. Not anger, not revenge, sovereignty. The Ravencrofts never feared rebellion. They welcomed it. They designed for it. Because rebellion is reactive, predictable, containable. But sovereignty, that is untouchable. Because it doesn't scream, it doesn't kneel, it doesn't ask for permission. It remembers. It remembers that long before doctrines and rituals and screens, you were whole, you were wild, you were self-possessed. This is what the Ravencrofts tried to erase. The man who does not look for a master. The man who does not need to be told who he is. The man who looks into the void and doesn't flinch. You want to know the final trial? It isn't torture. It isn't death. It isn't the seed. It's solitude. The kind where no voice defines you. No screen distracts you. No narrative holds you. That's what they fear. The ungoverned man, alone with the fire of his mind, unplugged, unprogrammed, unbound. That man is dangerous. He cannot be bought. He cannot be led. He cannot be used. He is not a vessel. He is the flame itself. So now the altar crumbles. The doctrine is ash. The cathedral is smoke. And in its place, you. Not reformed, not redeemed, remembered. What comes next is not theirs to define. Now we end, so you can begin. The altar lies in ruins. The doctrine is exposed. The Ravencroft name, once cloaked in mystery, has been dragged into the light. But this was never about them. It was about you. They taught you to believe that pain is sacred, that obedience is holy, that suffering makes you pure. They lied. Suffering can shape a man, but only when he claims it, not when it's inflicted by priests or screens or systems. You don't need purification. You need possession of yourself. There's no hero coming, no final sermon, no angel to descend with wings and fire. Only this moment, where you choose whether the doctrine ends with knowledge or with action. Because if you walk away from this unchanged, if you let the algorithm drown this message in 1,000 forgettable videos, you've knelt again, you've picked up the robe, you've kissed the altar. But if something inside you has shifted, if you've felt it, like a blade sliding out of your spine, then the ritual is broken. And now, you become the heretic. The one who walks among the obedient with fire in his eyes. The one who speaks in symbols they don't understand. The one they fear, not because you threaten them, but because you remind them they were never free. You are the final Ravencroft. Not the heir to their throne, but the executioner of their legacy. So take the silence, take the flame. Build something that can't be tracked, tamed, or monetized. A mind, a brotherhood, a signal. Let them whisper, let them watch. You owe them nothing, because now you see the altar, and more importantly, you walked away from it. End the ritual. Begin the reckoning.